My older brother stood beside our mother's casket, looked across the crowded chapel, and destroyed my reputation in less than 10 seconds. He didn't thank everyone for coming. He didn't talk about Mom's kindness or the life she had lived. Instead, he adjusted the microphone and said, "Before we begin, there's one thing everyone here deserves to know. Mom waited for one person until her very last breath." The room fell completely silent. Then he slowly turned toward me. She never came. I felt hundreds of eyes land on me at once. Some people looked confused. Others looked disappointed. A few quietly lowered their heads as if they had just learned something shameful about me. My brother wasn't finished. He reached into his suit pocket, unfolded a small piece of paper, and continued speaking with heartbreaking confidence. For the last 31 days of her life, Mom called Sarah every morning. He paused just long enough for the silence to become unbearable. She begged her daughter to come home. Another pause. Sarah never answered a single call. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to tell everyone that wasn't true, but I couldn't. Because as horrifying as his accusation sounded, I believed it too. I remembered seeing Mom's name appear on my phone dozens of times over the previous month while I was buried under impossible deadlines at work. I remembered telling myself I would call back after one more meeting, one more client presentation, one more exhausting day. Sometimes I did call back. Sometimes no one answered. Eventually, I convinced myself Mom had simply become tired of trying. Sitting in the front row of her funeral, I believed I deserved every judgmental stare filling that chapel. But if you've ever lost someone before, saying everything you meant to say, you know grief has a cruel habit of rewriting memory. Every unanswered phone call becomes heavier. Every postponed visit suddenly feels permanent. You replay ordinary decisions over and over, wondering which one changed everything without you realizing it. That's exactly what happened to me. By the time Mom passed away, I had spent weeks convincing myself work would calm down soon enough for us to have a proper weekend together. There would always be another Sunday lunch, another afternoon on her porch, another chance to hear the same stories I'd heard 100 times growing up. Instead, the funeral became our final conversation. And according to everyone listening to my brother that morning, I had chosen not to be a part of Mom's last month at all. My name is Sarah Collins. I was 34 years old when my brother made that speech, and I worked as a senior architect for a Chicago design firm specializing in children's hospitals and rehabilitation centers. My husband, Ethan, often joked that I could organize an entire construction site, but somehow still forget where I left my car keys. We had been married for 7 years and were raising an energetic 5-year-old daughter named Lily, who believed every flower she picked deserved its own tiny vase somewhere in the house. Life had become wonderfully full, but also dangerously busy. Mom lived nearly 4 hours away in southern Illinois after refusing every invitation to move closer to us. "This house still sounds like your father," she always said. "I'm not ready to leave it yet." After Dad died 8 years earlier, she poured every ounce of herself into maintaining the old farmhouse where we grew up. I worried about her constantly. I just didn't worry loudly enough. My brother Michael never left town. He managed Dad's hardware store after college, married his high school sweetheart, and lived less than 15 minutes from Mom for nearly 20 years. Everyone admired him for staying close while I chased career opportunities across the state. To be fair, I admired him too. Whenever Mom needed groceries, Michael handled it. If a storm damaged the roof, he was there before the insurance company even returned her call. Birthdays, holidays, doctor's appointments, he became the dependable son every family hopes someone will be. More than once, Mom thanked me for following my dreams instead of feeling guilty about moving away because Michael's already here if I need anything. I believed her. Looking back now, I wonder whether she believed it herself. The funeral ended with quiet hugs, whispered condolences, and dozens of sympathetic looks that somehow hurt more than angry ones. Nobody confronted me directly, but they didn't have to. Conversation stopped whenever I walked past. My cousins smiled politely before turning back toward Michael. Sterile people I'd known since childhood seemed uncertain how to speak to the daughter who supposedly ignored her dying mother's calls. Ethan squeezed my hand the entire drive home, but wisely said very little. Sometimes love doesn't arrive through perfect words. Sometimes it simply sits beside you while the world feels unbearably heavy. That night I lay awake, replaying Michael's speech again and again, wondering whether grief had simply revealed an ugly truth about myself that I had been too busy to notice. 3 weeks later, I drove back to Mom's farmhouse alone to finish packing the last boxes before putting the property on the market. The house felt painfully quiet without her humming in the kitchen or calling my name from the garden. I spent most of the afternoon sorting old photographs, sewing supplies, and recipe cards she insisted nobody else could understand. Just before sunset, I carried a dusty basket of fabric upstairs to the guest bedroom. As I set it on the floor, I heard something that instantly froze me where I stood. A ringtone. Da-da-da. Soft. So bad. Faint. Sadness. But unmistakable. Unmistakable. Not my phone. Ivan. Not Ethan's. Spurth. Somewhere inside the room, an old flip phone I met was still ringing. The ringtone stopped just as I reached the bedroom doorway. For a few seconds, the room became completely still again, leaving me wondering whether grief had finally started playing tricks on my mind. Then, just as I convinced myself I must have imagined it, the sound returned. One short ring. A pause. Then another. It wasn't coming from the closet or the dresser. It was softer than that, muffled somehow. I slowly knelt beside the old wicker sewing basket Mom had used for nearly 20 years. It overflowed with unfinished quilt squares, thread spools, measuring tape, and fabric scraps she refused to throw away because every piece becomes useful eventually. As I carefully lifted the folded fabric from the bottom of the basket, I saw a faded blue flip phone wrapped inside one of Dad's old handkerchiefs. The tiny front screen glowed weakly before going dark again. My heart immediately began racing. I picked it up carefully, surprised to discover it still had battery power. The phone looked exactly like the one Mom carried before smartphones became common. I remembered buying her a brand new smartphone almost 3 years earlier because she kept complaining that the tiny buttons on her flip phone were getting harder to press. She resisted for weeks before finally agreeing to learn how to use it. Michael even joked that teaching Mom to text deserved its own Olympic medal. After that Christmas, I never saw the old phone again. I naturally assumed she had thrown it away. Yet here it was, carefully hidden beneath sewing supplies in a room no one had entered since before her funeral. The screen slowly lit up again. It's an one missed call. Ever. Unknown number. I said. A second notification immediately appeared beneath it. Vague. 31 unheard voicemails. I stared at the number for several long seconds, convinced I had misread it. 31. Exactly the number Michael mentioned during his funeral speech. My pulse quickened as dozens of thoughts crashed into each other. Had Mom somehow been using 2 phones? Why would she hide one? More importantly, if these messages were sitting unopened inside this phone, then what calls had Michael been talking about in front of the entire church? I pressed the voicemail icon instinctively. Nothing happened. Down. The phone requested a 4-digit passcode. I tried Mom's birthday BM. Wrong. Vade. Dad's birthday. Amarca. Wrong. I'm sorry, Vin. Their anniversary. Too fit. Wrong again. Just. The phone locked for 30 seconds before allowing another attempt. I sat quietly on the bedroom floor, staring at the small screen, while memories slowly surfaced. Mom wrote passwords everywhere because she never trusted herself to remember them. Grocery lists, calendar reminders, sticky notes taped inside recipe books. She even kept a tiny notebook beside the kitchen phone, containing birthdays, utility account numbers, and every PIN she ever created. If she protected this phone with a passcode, there was almost certainly another place where she had written it down. For the next hour, I searched the farmhouse more carefully than I had searched anything in my life. Kitchen drawers, recipe binders, address books, Dad's old desk, even the small ceramic cookie jar where Mom used to hide spare house keys. Nothing. Every ordinary hiding place came up empty. Just as frustration began replacing curiosity, I wandered back into her sewing room and noticed something I had somehow overlooked all afternoon. Hanging beside the window was the faded wall calendar Mom insisted on keeping even after retirement because she liked crossing off each day with a blue pen. Every month contained little handwritten reminders. Rotate tomatoes. That was church potluck. Aman. Lily's birthday. John. Call Sarah. That last note appeared over and over again. Unquality. Nearly every day. Uncalled. Sometimes twice. Shit. Not because Mom forgot. Honest. Because she kept trying. She said. My chest tightened as I flipped backward through previous months. The pattern continued. Call Sarah. Call Sarah after lunch. Try Sarah again tonight. Some days the reminder had been crossed out. Other days it remained untouched. Looking at those tiny handwritten notes felt like watching my mother's loneliness spread across an entire season, one square at a time. Michael's words at the funeral suddenly echoed through my mind again. Mom called her every single day, except now I wasn't sure which phone she had been calling from. Today, as evening settled outside, I carried the flip phone downstairs and plugged its charger into the kitchen wall. While waiting for the battery to recover, I absent-mindedly opened one of Mom's favorite recipe books, hoping the familiar handwriting might somehow calm my thoughts. A folded grocery receipt slipped onto the table. I almost ignored it, before noticing 4 numbers written neatly across the back in blue ink. 0417. No explanation. Photographers restored. No label. Everything. Just 4 numbers. My breath caught. So cute. April 17th. This, Dad's birthday. Martin. Not his birth year. That too. Not Mom's. Did his birthday. The same date she always insisted was the easiest number in the world to remember. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Entered Mutter. 0. Jowit. 4. Mathis. 1. Jam. 7. 7. The screen unlocked instantly. Dad. For a moment, nothing happened. So, then the voicemail inbox opened. 31 new messages. Every single one. All marked Neokeru, unplayed. Salem. I reached toward the first message. Doctor, then stopped. I am. Because another notification suddenly appeared across the screen. Not a voicemail. Not a missed call. She do. A text message. Deftly Dan. Received. Madagascar. The night before Mom died. From Michael. It contained only 7 words. D. Don't call Sarah anymore. She knows. My hand froze above the screen. I hadn't listened to a single voicemail yet, but somehow, everything had already changed. I kept my finger hovering above the first voicemail for several seconds without pressing play. 31 unheard messages waited inside that old flip phone. But somehow, the text message Michael had sent the night before Mom died felt even heavier. Don't call Sarah anymore. She knows. Those 7 words refused to leave my mind because they raised a question I couldn't answer. What exactly was I supposed to know? If Michael truly believed I had abandoned Mom, why would he tell her to stop calling me? And if he knew something I didn't, why mention it only one day before she passed away? Ethan arrived at the farmhouse just after sunset and found me sitting at the kitchen table with the phone still in my hands. I showed him the text message without saying a word. He read it twice before quietly asking, "Have you listened to any of the voicemails yet?" I slowly shook my head. I'm afraid that once I hear her voice, everything Michael said at the funeral is either going to become true or completely fall apart. Ethan pulled out the chair beside me and reached for my hand. He had known my mother for nearly a decade, long enough to understand that she never left emotional conversations unfinished. If Mom had recorded 31 messages instead of giving up after the first few unanswered calls, then every voicemail probably mattered. Start with the first one, he suggested gently. Don't try to solve the entire month tonight. His advice sounded exactly like something Mom would have said whenever I overwhelmed myself with work. I took a slow breath, tapped the oldest message, and placed the phone on speaker. For a brief moment, there was only static. Then I heard the familiar sound of my mother's laugh before she even began speaking, as though she'd accidentally pressed the record button a second too early. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom said warmly. "It's Monday morning, and I know you're probably already halfway to the office because you inherited your father's impossible work ethic." I smiled through unexpected tears. She sounded healthy, relaxed, nothing like someone begging desperately for attention. "I just wanted to tell you that the roses finally bloomed along the back fence. The yellow ones you planted with your dad are covered in flowers this year. I took pictures, but you know me, I still haven't figured out how to send them from that fancy phone you bought me." She laughed softly again before continuing. "Call me whenever you have time. No rush. I just wanted you to know I was thinking about you. Love you, honey." The message ended with the familiar beep. I stared at the phone in complete silence. There had been no guilt, no pleading, no mention of illness, nothing remotely close to the heartbreaking version Michael described at the funeral. I immediately opened the second voicemail, expecting the tone to change. Instead, Mom sounded almost identical. She talked about Lily starting kindergarten soon, joked that Dad would have spoiled his granddaughter rotten, and reminded me to water the tomato plants Ethan had given her the previous spring. Before hanging up, she casually mentioned she had been trying to learn the new smartphone, but still preferred the old blue phone because it never argues with me. Ethan looked at me the moment the message ended. "Did you catch that?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Mom hadn't said she was calling from the smartphone everyone believed she used every day. She specifically mentioned preferring the old flip phone. That single sentence suddenly made the hidden device feel much more important. If she continued using it throughout her final month, why had every family member, including me, believed she had completely switched to the newer phone? Over the next hour, we listened to 4 more messages. Each one followed the same gentle rhythm. Mom never accused me of ignoring her. She never sounded abandoned or desperate. Some days, she simply shared ordinary moments from her garden. Other days, she recommended a book she thought I might enjoy, or reminded me to take breaks from work because architects forget the world keeps turning outside office windows. The 5th voicemail ended with something that made both Ethan and me sit perfectly still. "I almost called you on the other phone today," she said thoughtfully. "But Michael insists I should only use the new one because it'll be easier for everyone. Maybe he's right. I just keep forgetting where he puts this old thing." The message stopped there, but the implication lingered. Mom hadn't hidden the flip phone from us. Someone else had been deciding when she could use it. I leaned back in my chair, replaying those final words over and over in my mind. Until that moment, I had unconsciously accepted Michael's version of events because it matched my own guilt. I had assumed Mom spent her final weeks calling a smartphone I sometimes failed to answer, while he faithfully cared for her every day. But the voicemails told a completely different story. They revealed a woman who remained hopeful, patient, and oddly confused about why one phone mattered more than another. More importantly, they hinted that Michael had become the person managing which device she used. That alone didn't prove he had manipulated anything. There were perfectly reasonable explanations. Maybe the smartphone had better reception. Maybe he simply wanted Mom to learn modern technology. Effortless "don't call Sarah anymore, she knows" kept colliding with those innocent voicemails until neither explanation felt complete. Before starting the 7th message, I noticed a small icon I hadn't paid attention to earlier. The phone wasn't just storing voicemails. It also contained a folder labeled Draft Messages. Curious, I opened it, expecting to find unfinished grocery lists or accidental notes. Instead, I found 12 text messages Mom had written but never sent. Most were ordinary reminders asking if Lily wanted homemade cookies or whether Ethan had fixed the leaky kitchen faucet. But the most recent draft, created only 2 days before her death, was different. It read, "Sarah, if Michael tells you I'm using the new phone all the time, that's not true. I keep asking him where my blue phone went because I think your calls are still coming there. Maybe I'm just getting forgetful, but something doesn't feel right." The message ended abruptly without ever being sent. Ethan slowly looked up from the screen, his expression mirroring my own growing unease. I closed the draft folder and rested both hands on the kitchen table, suddenly realizing this story had become much larger than 31 unanswered voicemails. Someone had convinced my mother that I wasn't calling. Someone had convinced me that she preferred using a different phone. And somehow, between those 2 separate beliefs, an entire month of conversations disappeared. I reached for the 8th voicemail, But before pressing play, another notification caught my attention. Unlike the others, this wasn't a voicemail or a draft text. It was a saved voice memo, recorded just 3 days before Mom died. The title was only 4 words. If Sarah hears this, for nearly a full minute, neither Ethan nor I touched the screen. The saved voice memo sat between the draft messages and the voicemail folder, as though it had been waiting quietly for someone to notice it. Unlike the other recordings, it wasn't automatically dated by the phone. Mom had renamed it herself using only 4 words. If Sarah hears this. The title alone made my chest tighten because it sounded intentional. Voicemails are spontaneous. People leave them expecting someone to listen eventually. A voice memo is different. It's something you record when you aren't sure you'll ever get the chance to say the words face to face. I took a deep breath and pressed play. The recording began with several seconds of rustling fabric before Mom sighed softly. "I hope I'm just being silly," she said with a nervous laugh. "Your father always told me I worried too much. Maybe he's right." She paused again, as though trying to decide whether to continue. "But if you're hearing this, then something happened before I could explain." Her voice sounded different from the voicemails. Not frightened, but more thoughtful. Almost as though she were talking to herself as much as to me. "Sweetheart, if I've already figured everything out by the time you hear this, you can laugh at me for being dramatic." Another small laugh escaped her before the tone shifted. "But lately, I keep feeling like I'm living in 2 different worlds. One world is the one Michael describes to me. The other is the one I remember. They don't match anymore." I instinctively looked at Ethan. Neither of us spoke. Mom continued slowly, choosing every word with remarkable care. "Michael tells me you've become too busy to answer my calls. He says you're always traveling, always in meetings, always promising to visit someday. I believed him at first, because you've worked so hard for everything you've earned." She hesitated. "But every time we do talk, you sound surprised that I've been trying to reach you." I replayed that sentence twice because it struck me with terrifying precision. Mom wasn't saying I ignored her. She was saying our conversations never matched the story she kept hearing. Looking back, I remembered several phone calls during those final months when Mom casually thanked me for calling back so quickly, even though I couldn't remember missing any earlier calls. At the time, I assumed she simply confused the days. Now those moments suddenly carried a different meaning. Mom continued. "I asked Michael whether maybe one of our phones wasn't working correctly. He told me not to worry because he had already helped you set everything up. That didn't make much sense because you always helped me with my phones, not the other way around." Her voice softened even further. "Maybe I'm becoming forgetful. Maybe I'm just embarrassed to admit I can't keep up with technology anymore. But every time I ask where my blue phone went, he changes the subject." The recording paused briefly before another sound drifted through the speaker. It took me a second to realize what I was hearing. Mom had placed the phone on a kitchen counter, but forgotten to stop recording. Faint voices echoed in the background. One belonged to her, the other, unmistakably, belonged to Michael. We leaned closer to hear them. "Where's my old phone?" Mom asked. Michael answered so quietly that several words disappeared beneath the static, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. "You don't need that one anymore. Sarah only uses the new number now." Mom sounded uncertain. "She never told me she changed numbers." Michael replied immediately. "She probably forgot. She's busy, Mom. The recording ended a few moments later with the sound of the phone being picked up again before the file abruptly stopped. Ethan slowly exhaled. He wasn't just giving her different information, he said quietly. He was giving both of you different versions of the same reality. I nodded, unable to look away from the screen. Until that moment, I kept searching for one dramatic act that explained everything. A deleted voicemail, a blocked number, some obvious betrayal. Instead, what emerged felt much more subtle and therefore far more believable. Mom trusted Michael because he lived nearby and handled most of her daily needs. I trusted him because he always seemed dependable and never gave me a reason not to. Between those two separate trusts, tiny misunderstandings multiplied until they became an entirely different story. Nobody questioned them because each misunderstanding sounded reasonable by itself. Determined to understand exactly how it happened, I opened the phone's contact list. Something immediately caught my attention. There was only one number saved under my name. It wasn't my current cell phone. It wasn't even my previous one. It belonged to a company-issued phone I had surrendered nearly 18 months before Mom became ill. I stared at the outdated number in disbelief. "That's impossible," I whispered. I had personally programmed Mom's new smartphone with my updated contact information the day I bought it for her. Ethan frowned. Maybe she accidentally copied the old contact into the flip phone. I almost agreed before another detail stopped me. The contact had been edited only 6 weeks before Mom died. Someone had manually updated the entry, not with my current number, but with the one that no longer existed. Whoever changed it didn't make a random mistake. They replaced a working number with one guaranteed never to reach me. I suddenly remembered something else. About 2 months before Mom passed away, Michael called asking whether I had changed phone carriers. When I told him no, he casually replied, "Weird. Mom keeps saying your number doesn't work sometimes." I laughed it off because I'd never experienced any problems with my phone. We moved on to another topic within seconds. Now that conversation returned with chilling clarity. He hadn't been asking out of curiosity. He'd been checking whether I already knew something was wrong. My stomach turned as I realized how carefully the confusion had been managed. If Mom called the old number, she reached no one. If she complained, Michael blamed technology. If I called the smartphone, we spoke normally, convincing me everything was fine. Neither of us realized we were living inside two completely different communication patterns. As midnight approached, I set the phone down and rubbed my tired eyes. We still hadn't listened to more than a handful of the 31 voicemails. The picture growing in front of us already felt painfully clear. Then Ethan noticed something I had completely overlooked. "Sarah," he said softly, pointing toward the call history. "Look at the dates." I leaned closer. Nearly every unanswered outgoing call from the flip phone occurred early in the morning, exactly when Michael claimed Mom had been begging me to come home. But mixed among them were dozens of successful incoming calls, all from the same unfamiliar landline number. Curious, I tapped one of the entries. Instead of opening a contact, the phone displayed a handwritten note Mom had attached to the number months earlier. It contained only one sentence. "This is the phone Sarah always answers." I frowned. Excellent. I had never seen that number before. And it wasn't mine. I stared at the unfamiliar landline number for several long seconds, convinced it had to be some kind of mistake. Mom had attached a personal note to it. "This is the phone Sarah always answers." Yet I had never seen those digits before in my life. Ethan took out his own phone and searched the area code. It belonged to Southern Illinois, only a few miles from Mom's farmhouse, which ruled out the possibility that it was one of my office numbers or an old apartment landline. "Call it," he suggested quietly. I hesitated. It was nearly midnight, and the last thing I wanted was to wake a stranger because of a mystery buried inside my mother's old flip phone. Still, if that number somehow became part of the misunderstanding between Mom and me, it might also explain why she believed I wasn't answering. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. The line rang only once before a tired, elderly woman's voice answered. "St. Agnes Community Church," she said gently, emotionally. "This is Margaret speaking," she said. For a moment, I couldn't respond. I knew St. Boom Agnes well. Mom volunteered there every Thursday afternoon, arranging flowers in the sanctuary and helping prepare meals for the church's food pantry. Margaret had known our family for years. "Margaret, this is Sarah Collins." There was a brief pause before her voice brightened immediately. "Sarah! Oh, honey, I've been hoping you'd call someday." Her words caught me completely off guard. "You've been hoping I'd call?" Margaret sounded surprised by my confusion. "Your mother asked me to keep trying your office whenever she couldn't reach you herself. She worried your work schedule made your cell phone difficult to catch." My pulse quickened. "My office?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Yes, dear. Michael brought me the number and said that's where you preferred people contact you during the day." I slowly closed my eyes. My office had changed buildings nearly 2 years earlier. Every direct phone extension from the old building had been disconnected when the company relocated downtown. If Margaret had been calling the number Michael gave her, she had been calling an office that no longer existed. "Margaret," I asked carefully, "did my mother know those calls weren't reaching me?" The older woman sighed sadly. "No. Michael always told her you were traveling or working with clients when no one answered." I gripped the edge of the kitchen table to steady myself. "Did Mom ever ask you to try my cell phone?" Margaret became very quiet before answering. "Several times. But Michael insisted you rarely answered personal calls during business hours, and that using your office line was the only reliable way to reach you." Ethan looked at me across the table. Neither of us needed to say what we were both realizing. Someone hadn't merely created confusion. Someone had carefully managed every possible path that might have allowed my mother to reach me directly. Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "Sarah, there was something else." Her voice grew softer. "About 3 weeks before your mother passed away, she stopped by the church after Bible study, carrying that little blue flip phone she loved so much. She asked whether I could help her find your number because she said Michael kept telling her she already had the right one. But something didn't feel right." I felt my throat tighten. "Were you able to help her?" Margaret sighed. "No. I offered to call information services or look you up online, but your mother smiled and said she didn't want to embarrass Michael if she was simply forgetting things." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Even while doubting what she had been told, Mom chose protecting her son's feelings over questioning his honesty. That sounded exactly like her. She had always believed misunderstandings were more common than bad intentions. After thanking Margaret, I ended the call and sat silently for several minutes. The farmhouse felt impossibly still, except for the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock Dad repaired at least a dozen times during my childhood. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, searching for a simpler explanation. Maybe Michael accidentally copied an outdated office number. Maybe he honestly believed it still worked. Maybe everything we'd uncovered so far resulted from a chain of innocent mistakes rather than deliberate manipulation. But every new piece of evidence seemed to point in the same direction. The wrong cell number, the disconnected office line, the hidden flip phone, the draft message Mom never sent. None of those facts proved Michael intended to separate us, but together they painted a picture that became harder to dismiss with each passing hour. The following morning, I drove to my former employer's old office building before heading back to Chicago. Although the company had moved, the receptionist in the lobby still recognized me. After explaining why I had come, she searched the archived phone directory stored in the building's records. The extension Michael gave Margaret hadn't belonged to me. It hadn't even belonged to our architecture department. It connected directly to an empty conference room that no employee answered unless a meeting happened to be taking place. I thanked her quietly before walking back to my car. My hands trembled as I sat behind the steering wheel. This wasn't an outdated contact. It wasn't a typo. Whoever wrote that number down had chosen one almost guaranteed never to reach a real person, while still looking believable enough that no one would immediately question it. On the drive home, Ethan finally asked the question both of us had been avoiding. Why? I stared at the highway stretching ahead before answering. I don't know. That was the truth. I understood how someone could slowly isolate two people by controlling information. I just couldn't understand why Michael would do it. He loved Mom. I'd never doubted that for a second. He spent countless hours caring for her after Dad died, drove her to medical appointments, repaired the farmhouse whenever something broke, and rarely complained. None of those things fit the image of a man intentionally keeping his own sister away. Human beings are rarely one thing. Good people sometimes make terrible decisions, but terrible decisions usually begin with reasons that make sense to the person making them. Somewhere between love, fear, obligation, and resentment, something had gone terribly wrong. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, I returned to the flip phone, determined to continue listening before confronting anyone. I opened the voicemail list again, this time choosing the 12th message instead of the next one in order. Mom sounded more tired than before, though her voice remained gentle. "Hi, sweetheart," she began. "I know you're busy, so I'll keep this short. Michael says you probably won't make it for Thanksgiving because work is sending you out of state." I frowned immediately. I hadn't traveled anywhere that month. In fact, Ethan and I had spent Thanksgiving waiting for Michael to call with a time so we could drive down together, only to receive a last-minute message saying Mom wasn't feeling well enough for visitors. My stomach dropped as the voicemail continued. "Don't worry about me," Mom said softly. "We'll celebrate another time. Just promise me you'll hug Lily extra tight today." The message ended with a quiet, "I love you." I lowered the phone into my lap, suddenly remembering something I hadn't thought about since that holiday. Michael hadn't simply told me Mom was too sick for company. He had sent me a photograph. Mom asleep in her recliner, blanket over her shoulders. Crimin. Television on in the background. The body. I had looked at the picture, believed him, and turned the car around. So, For the first time, I wondered exactly when that photograph had really been taken. I drove straight to the farmhouse the following morning with one question repeating in my mind. If the Thanksgiving photograph wasn't taken the day Michael claimed it was, then every assumption I'd made during Mom's final months deserved to be questioned. The picture had lived in my phone for almost a year, buried among hundreds of ordinary family snapshots. I found it within seconds and enlarged it while sitting in the driveway. At first glance, it looked exactly as I remembered. Mom was asleep in her favorite recliner. A knitted blanket covered her legs, and afternoon sunlight poured through the living room window. Nothing seemed unusual until I looked beyond her shoulder. Hanging on the wall behind the television was the old family calendar Mom refused to replace until January each year. Even through the slightly blurry photo, I could clearly make out the month displayed across the top. It wasn't November. It was September. I zoomed in until the image became grainy, hoping I was mistaken. I wasn't. The autumn decorations sitting on the fireplace mantel matched September too. Mom always decorated for every season with almost military precision. Sunflowers stayed up through September, pumpkins appeared in October, and Thanksgiving decorations never came out until the weekend before the holiday. The photograph Michael sent to convince me not to visit had been taken at least 2 months earlier. I felt a cold wave of disbelief settle over me. He hadn't simply exaggerated Mom's condition. He had used an old photograph to make me believe she was asleep that afternoon when, in reality, I had no idea where she was or how she felt. Before confronting Michael, I forced myself to slow down. Dad used to say that anger collects evidence only for the answers it already wants. If I walked into my brother's house convinced he had intentionally manipulated our mother's final months, I might stop noticing facts that pointed somewhere else. So instead of driving across town, I walked back into the farmhouse and continued searching. For the first time, I wasn't looking for hidden phones or forgotten messages. I was looking for routines. Mom lived her life through routines. She wrote appointments on calendars, tucked receipts into recipe books, and folded every important paper into the same kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator. If something had disrupted those routines, the house itself might reveal it. Upstairs, inside the linen closet, I found a small spiral notebook labeled simply medication. Every page listed blood pressure readings, prescription schedules, and notes from doctor's appointments written in Mom's careful handwriting. Most entries were ordinary. Feeling stronger today. Walked around the garden twice. Sarah called after work. That last note stopped me immediately. According to the date, Mom had written it on a Tuesday evening during the second week of October. I frowned because I hadn't spoken to her that day. At least, I didn't think I had. Curious, I opened my own phone records and searched the same date. There it was. An incoming call lasting only 3 minutes. I remembered it instantly. I had been leaving a construction site when an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. The connection kept cutting in and out, and I assumed it was a spam call until I heard Mom's voice faintly asking whether I had made it home safely. We laughed, talked briefly, and promised to catch up properly over the weekend. Except, propiedad. That call hadn't come from her smartphone. It came from the blue flip phone. Which meant she had occasionally found it, despite Michael insisting she no longer needed it. The realization shifted something important in my mind. Until now, I had imagined 31 days of complete silence between Mom and me. The truth was more complicated. Whenever she managed to get hold of the old phone, she reached me. Whenever Michael steered her back toward the newer phone or toward the disconnected numbers, he controlled, the connection disappeared again. We hadn't been completely separated. We had been living through short moments of clarity, surrounded by long stretches of carefully managed confusion. That explained why neither of us fully questioned what was happening. Those occasional successful conversations reassured us that everything was basically fine, even while the larger pattern quietly unraveled around us. As I continued reading the notebook, another name appeared several times beneath medication reminders. Chap. Dr. Milla Elaine Porter. Mom had written. Dr. Porter says memory is normal for my age. Stress makes it worse. A second entry, several weeks later, read, Michael worries too much about my forgetting things. I immediately called the clinic, not expecting anyone to discuss private medical information. The receptionist politely confirmed they couldn't release records without proper authorization, but did mention something unexpected after verifying my identity as next of kin. Dr. Porter asked us to keep a copy of your mother's cognitive assessment because she was concerned the family might misunderstand the results. My pulse quickened. Misunderstand how? The receptionist hesitated before answering carefully. Your mother did not meet the criteria for dementia. She had mild age-related memory changes, but her physician specifically documented that she remained capable of making her own decisions. I thanked her and sat silently in the kitchen for several minutes. Throughout Mom's final year, Michael often mentioned that her memory was getting worse. He never claimed she had dementia outright, but he repeated enough small comments that everyone, including me, gradually accepted the idea that she was becoming increasingly confused. Whenever Mom remembered events differently than Michael did, I quietly assumed Michael's version was probably more accurate because he saw her every day. Dr. Porter's assessment shattered that assumption. Mom wasn't imagining that something felt wrong with her phones. She wasn't inventing strange inconsistencies. She noticed them because they were actually happening. That afternoon, I drove to Dr. Porter's office and requested a copy of the assessment as Mom's legal next of kin. After reviewing the paperwork, the doctor herself agreed to meet with me for a few minutes. She remembered my mother immediately. Margaret Collins was one of the most organized patients I ever treated, she said warmly. She carried color-coded notebooks to every appointment. I smiled because that sounded exactly right. Then Dr. Porter's expression became more thoughtful. There was one conversation I've wondered about ever since she passed away. My heart skipped. What conversation? The doctor folded her hands on the desk before answering. Your mother asked me whether it was possible for someone to feel isolated without anyone around them realizing it. She paused. I asked if someone was preventing her from seeing family. She said no. Another pause. Then she smiled and said, I think everyone is trying to help me. I just wish they would stop helping quite so much. Those words stayed with me all the way back to the farmhouse. Mom hadn't viewed herself as a victim. She hadn't accused Michael of cruelty. She sensed that decisions were being made on her behalf without her understanding why. And she struggled to reconcile that feeling with the son she loved deeply. The more evidence I uncovered, the less this resembled a simple scheme to keep us apart. It felt like something that began as overprotection and slowly crossed a line no one acknowledged until it was too late. But one question still remained unanswered. Why had Michael stood in front of an entire church and publicly claimed I abandoned Mom if he knew the truth was far more complicated? As evening approached, I picked up the blue flip phone once again and opened the voicemail list. This time, I skipped to the final message, recorded less than 12 hours before Mom died. Before pressing play, I noticed something I had somehow missed all week. That the voicemail wasn't left by Mom. Jamie. It was left by Michael Kennedy. I stared at the sender's name for several long seconds before pressing play. Every voicemail I had heard so far carried Mom's gentle optimism, even when she was lonely or confused. Seeing Michael's name attached to the final message felt completely different. It wasn't because I suddenly believed he was a villain. It was because, after everything I'd uncovered during the past 3 days, I no longer knew which version of my brother was real. The recording began almost immediately. Sterile voice sounded tired, quieter than I had ever heard it, and there was no sign that he knew the message would one day become evidence against him. "Mom," he said softly. "It's me. You left your blue phone at church again, so I'm bringing it back after I stop by the pharmacy. Please don't keep hiding it from me anymore. I'm not trying to upset you." He paused for several seconds before continuing. "And please, don't keep calling Sarah from this phone. It only makes everything harder." My heart sank. Those final words landed with a completely different weight than the text message I had found earlier. He wasn't speaking with anger. He sounded exhausted. The recording continued after another brief silence. "She has a big presentation tomorrow. If she thinks you're getting worse, she'll come down here, quit half her projects, and blame herself for the rest of her life. That's not what you want." I looked at Ethan, who remained just as still as I was. Michael sighed heavily before adding, "I know you miss her. I miss Dad too, but she already carries enough guilt for moving away. Please don't make her choose between her family and the career she worked so hard to build." The message ended without another word. I replayed it twice before setting the phone down. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't proof of innocence either. It was something far more unsettling. It suggested that Michael genuinely believed he was protecting both Mom and me, even while making decisions neither of us had asked him to make. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to imagine the past year from Michael's perspective instead of my own. He had watched Dad die unexpectedly, inherited responsibility for the hardware store, and become Mom's primary caregiver almost overnight. Every doctor's appointment, every leaking pipe, every emergency room visit, every lonely evening after Dad's death, he had carried those moments while I lived 4 hours away. I visited whenever I could, called often, and sent money whenever Mom refused to let Michael pay for repairs alone. But there was no denying one uncomfortable truth. When something happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, Michael was always the one getting the phone call. That reality didn't excuse what I had discovered. It did, however, explain how someone could slowly convince himself that protecting a parent also meant controlling the information they shared with everyone else. I called Margaret at St. Agnes one more time that afternoon, hoping to answer the final question that still haunted me. Did my mother ever talk about Michael after those phone problems started? Margaret hesitated before answering. Not the way you probably expect. She explained that Mom never complained about my brother. Instead, she constantly defended him. Whenever church friends suggested Michael seemed overprotective, Mom smiled and said he simply worried because he'd already lost one parent. Your mother told me something about a week before she died that I've never forgotten, Margaret said quietly. She looked out the church window and said, "Sometimes love gets so frightened of losing someone that it starts holding them too tightly." I closed my eyes because those words sounded exactly like Mom. She had seen Michael's fear long before anyone else recognized the consequences of it. That evening, I finally called my brother. He answered on the second ring, sounding surprised but not defensive. "Sarah?" I took a slow breath before speaking. I found Mom's blue phone. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. When Michael finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of confidence. "I figured you might someday." I didn't accuse him. I didn't mention the voicemails, the church calls, or Dr. Porter's assessment. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Why did you tell everyone I abandoned Mom?" He exhaled slowly before answering. "Because by the end, I needed someone to blame more than I needed to admit I'd made a terrible mistake." Tears immediately filled my eyes, but I remained silent while he continued. "It started with one decision. Mom cried every time you left after visiting, and I hated watching it. I thought if she called a little less, maybe she'd stop breaking her own heart every evening waiting for the next visit. Then she started hiding the blue phone because she knew she could always reach you on it. So I put it away. Then I changed the contacts. Then I kept telling myself I'd fix everything next week." His voice broke completely. By the time I realized what I'd done, she was gone. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at the farmhouse. Not to argue. Not to decide who deserved forgiveness. Simply to sit inside the house where every misunderstanding had quietly grown. Michael arrived carrying a weathered cardboard box I had never seen before. He placed it on the kitchen table without speaking. Inside were dozens of notebooks filled with records of Mom's medications, grocery receipts, appointment schedules, home repair invoices, and handwritten reminders. He had documented nearly every day of the last 4 years of her life with almost obsessive detail. "I thought if I controlled enough things," he said quietly, "I could keep losing people from happening again." He looked around the empty kitchen before lowering his head. "Instead, I controlled the wrong things." I reached across the table and picked up one of the notebooks. Tucked inside the final page was a folded envelope addressed in Mom's handwriting. It simply read, "For both of my children. My parents." Michael stared at it. His face turned pale. "Mino, I've never seen that before." "No, neither had I." Together, we opened it. For several seconds, neither of us touched the envelope. It rested between us on the kitchen table where our mother had served thousands of ordinary family dinners over the years, and somehow that made it feel even heavier. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, but Mom's handwriting remained as neat and unmistakable as ever. She always wrote our names with the same careful loops, insisting that handwriting revealed whether someone had taken enough time to think before speaking. Michael looked at me uncertainly. "You should open it," he whispered. I slowly shook my head. "She addressed it to both of us." My brother nodded once, And together, we unfolded the letter that neither of us knew existed until that moment. So, my dear Sarah and Michael, it began. If you're reading this together, then something probably happened that neither of you knows how to fix. I hope I'm wrong. Mothers usually are when they worry too much. But if I'm right, then listen to me one more time before either of you decides who deserves the blame. I felt tears immediately filling my eyes because the letter sounded exactly like her. She never rushed to judgment. Even as children, when Michael and I argued, she rarely asked who started the fight. Instead, she wanted to know what each of us had been afraid of losing. As I continued reading, it became painfully clear she understood our family far better than either of us realized. Sarah, the letter continued, I know you've always worried that leaving home meant leaving me behind. You never did. Every time I saw one of your buildings in the newspaper or heard about another family helped by your work, I felt like a little piece of this old farmhouse had traveled into the world with you. Never let anyone convince you that distance and love are the same thing. They aren't. I had to stop reading for a moment because those were the exact words I had needed to hear for years. Ever since Dad died, a quiet part of me believed choosing my career meant choosing it over my family. Mom had spent her final days trying to free me from a guilt I didn't even realize she saw. Then the letter turned toward Michael. My sweet boy, you've spent your whole life trying to keep everyone safe. You inherited that from your father. But there's something your father learned before you did. Protecting people doesn't mean making their choices for them. Sometimes love has to trust, even when trusting feels terrifying. I glanced toward my brother. Tears streamed openly down his face as he read those lines over my shoulder. Mom wasn't condemning him. She wasn't excusing him either. She simply understood the fear that had slowly transformed into control. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I watched Michael stop defending himself. He wasn't searching for explanations anymore. He was grieving the realization that the very love he believed justified his decisions had become the reason our family drifted apart. The final page contained one last request. If your father is waiting for me by the time you read this, promise me something. Don't spend years arguing over which one of you failed me. I had 2 children who loved me more than they knew how to show. That's enough for any mother. If you want to honor us, stop counting the phone calls that never happened and start making the ones that still can. The letter ended simply, I loved you before you were born. I'll love you after I'm gone. That part never changes. Neither of us spoke for a long time after I finished reading. The farmhouse felt different somehow, as though the silence that had settled over it since Mom's funeral had finally been broken by the one voice both of us trusted completely. A week later, Michael asked whether I would meet him at the cemetery before the headstone for Mom was installed beside Dad's. When I arrived, he was already there, holding a small shovel and a weatherproof metal box. There's something I need to do before we close this chapter, he said quietly, emotionally. Inside the box were the blue flip phone, the handwritten medication notebook, copies of the voicemails, and Mom's letter. He looked at me before placing them gently into the box. I don't want to bury the truth, he said. I want to bury the shame. Instead of hiding what had happened, we donated digital copies of every voicemail and every recording to our family's shared archive, ensuring Lily and future generations would always know our parents through their own voices instead of through anyone else's version of the story. The metal box contained only the objects that had carried so much pain. The memories stayed with us. Over the following months, Michael quietly began changing in ways no apology alone could ever accomplish. He started taking Fridays off from the hardware store so he could volunteer at St. Agnes, helping older members of the community learn how to use their phones, organize emergency contacts, and stay connected with distant family. Margaret later told me he never spoke publicly about why he volunteered there. He simply showed up every week with coffee, patience, and handwritten instruction cards large enough for aging eyes to read comfortably. Watching him help strangers avoid the very mistakes that had fractured our own family didn't erase what happened. But it reminded me that genuine remorse is measured less by words than by the life someone chooses afterward. As for me, I stopped waiting for the perfect time to call the people I loved. Every Sunday evening, Lily and I now video call Ethan's parents, my cousins, and anyone else who might otherwise tell themselves we'll catch up another day. Sometimes the conversations last only 10 minutes. Sometimes they're wonderfully ordinary. We talk about gardens, school projects, recipes, and the weather. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would ever become a story worth telling online. And maybe that's exactly the point. Families aren't built by extraordinary conversations. They're built by ordinary ones, repeated often enough that nobody has to wonder whether they still matter. Several months after everything was finally resolved, Michael invited me back to the farmhouse one last time before we officially transferred ownership into both our names, exactly as Mom's will had always intended. Together, we walked through every room, laughing over old childhood memories instead of arguing over the past. Before locking the front door, I noticed the blue flip phone resting on the kitchen windowsill, where sunlight poured across its worn plastic cover. "You keeping it?" I asked. Michael smiled sadly and shook his head. "No." He picked it up and handed it to Lily, who had absolutely no idea what it was. She examined it curiously before asking, "Does it still work?" I looked at my brother, then back at my daughter. "It does," I answered softly. It reminded our family that hearing someone's voice can change everything. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I hope you'll remember one thing my mother understood long before the rest of us did. The greatest distances inside a family aren't always measured in miles. Sometimes they're measured in assumptions, in messages never delivered, in conversations someone else promises to have for us. Technology didn't separate our family. Fear did. Fear of loss. Fear of guilt. Fear of watching someone we loved choose a life that no longer revolved around us. The tragedy wasn't that my brother stopped loving us. The tragedy was that he loved us so anxiously, he began deciding what truths we could handle, until those decisions became their own kind of betrayal. The greatest revenge I ever received wasn't exposing Michael in front of our relatives. It wasn't proving that I never abandoned my mother. It wasn't discovering 31 unheard voicemails or finding the blue flip phone hidden beneath a basket of sewing supplies. The greatest revenge was much quieter than that. It was making sure my mother's real voice became the one our family remembered, not the stories told about her after she was gone. Because lies can survive for years when they're repeated often enough. But one honest voice, heard at the right moment, can still bring a family home.